So our speaker for today is Richard Cizik, my dear old friend, and I'm so glad we were finally able to get you in here and to Wrestlers. And we wanted to share a little bit. I actually benefited greatly from his ministry in many ways. You know, he's written some books like this book, The High Cost of Indifference, where he tried to challenge us to think about the relationship of faith and politics. But one of the most helpful booklets that I got from him was this little pamphlet that is called Networking in Order to Find a Job. You remember that?
I do, Paul. I think I may need it now.
We need that from time to time.
Yeah.
Richard Cizik is the president of the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, a faith-based organization committed to an agenda that fosters values consistent with an open society. He served for 10 years as vice president for governmental affairs for the National Association of Evangelicals, the top staff position in the organization here, a post he left in 2008 after enduring years of political opposition from the religious right. An interview with NPR's Fresh Air, Terry Gross, remember, in which he expressed his support for civil unions, climate change, and political collaboration with the Obama administration, led to a national uproar among evangelicals over and over 100 top leaders defecting to a new evangelical agenda. As a result, Rich founded the new Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, and he has been a leader in bringing together evangelical scholars and policymakers in the search for common ground on issues of national and international importance. And so, of course, today we're going to be hearing from him talking about his recent visit to Iran, and it's called Vignettes from Iran. Let me say a little bit more about his background.
Oh, that's enough.
Oh no, I want to mention a couple things. He was a participant in the Climate Forum. He's been a leader in terms of bringing awareness about climate change issues. He met with scientists like E.O. Wilson in some forums on evangelical scientists and Call for Action, a document that came together that has stirred up a lot of interest. In 2008, he was named to Time Magazine's Time 100 list of most influential people. Rich has published many articles and editorials, and I have this book, The High Cost of Indifference, that he wrote back in the 80s, and challenging us to these things. He graduated with a BA cum laude in political science from Whitworth University, has an MD from Denver Seminary, Master of Divinity. D-Min. Not an MD. MA Public Affairs at GW University. And in 2005, he was awarded the ecclesiastical degree, Doctor of Divinity, honoris causa, Methodist Episcopal Church, USA. So, Richard, thank you for coming to be with us today. We've got your slides ready.
Thank you. Paul and Kathy have been old friends, as of many of you. Looking at John. Thank you for inviting me.
That goes forward, that goes back.
Oh, okay. I'm still trying to shut off my phone, so let me just give up. If it rings, you'll forgive me. Thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm. What was I going to say? I came last night to the HRC dinner, Human Rights Campaign dinner, and then I went home and I thought, well, will I make it back in the morning? And I thought, well, maybe not, but I will do my best, and I did. And as it is with these storms like this, when everyone says, especially the weathermen, that the roads are going to be terrible, get off the roads, that means you can get off the you can get on the roads, because you know no one will be there. I was this last weekend in Divinity School at for a Faith and Culture Center down in Nashville. This is at Vanderbilt. And they had a conference that was called Our Muslim Neighbor. And so I showed up in the chapel, and I noted that this chapel podium was sort of like yours here. You know, you climb up really, really high, and you stand up there, and you wonder, my gosh, will anybody even see me? And I thought, well, this morning I don't have to worry about that. I can come here and have a lot of fun with you all and learn together. And so I'm looking forward to that. Let me say a prayer. Maybe I will begin with another verse. I tell you what I was thinking about, and some of what I said to a conference that is, as I said, our Muslim neighbor that was at Vanderbilt. What I said was that if you look at Luke 10:29, in which, in this famous Good Samaritan passage, I hardly need to read it, a man is traveling on a dangerous road. He's attacked by bandits, robbed and left for dead, and two people come by who should care and don't. And then one who does come by and shouldn't does. You know the story. And that's the traditional preaching of the classic story. God cares, calls us to care not only for our neighbor, but to see our neighbor as someone potentially in need. And so I've taken it a little further to say that beyond simply that, you know, God doesn't just ask us to care or asks us who our neighbor is. He asks who acted like a neighbor. Who acted like a neighbor. And the answer to that question, of course, is obvious. It's the one who went out of his way. But there's another side. There's another interpretation which you may not have heard of. And it goes as follows. And it raises an interesting question, which is, who has been our neighbor to us, caring for us in need? So, this is really uncomfortable. Why? Because to we who are Americans, we spend so much of our time, energy, getting education, money, in other words, in order to be invulnerable. Invulnerable. That is, trying as greatly as possible through all of our lives to prevent being the person in the ditch beside the road. Isn't that right? Anybody guilty, raise your hand. Okay, you don't have to raise your hand. Perhaps it's the fear as we get older. I'm getting older. John, by the way, Paul, by the way, that book came out in like 1982. I came to the NAE in 1980. Gosh, that was a long time ago. But the point is, we spend a lot of our time avoiding owing others, being in need. And as we get older, which was my point, as the gray hair increases, we think more and more, how am I going to avoid owing somebody else? And so, if I'm right in reading the parable, it has 2 points. One is that it involves not only giving help, but being willing to receive it. Even especially from those whom we would most unlikely be willing to receive it. Wow. Especially people who are not like us. I picked out, by way of introduction, one other little vignette. This was out in 2011, and it talks about a presidential candidate, or one or two, who mentioned the, quote, dangers of Sharia law for the U.S., and how the president was a Muslim, and he would be, another one would be uncomfortable with a Muslim in his cabinet or as a federal judge. And another even talked about a loyalty oath for Muslims, and only Muslims who wanted to serve in the administration. So, is this 2015? Oh, no. This is 2011, and it refers to events in 2008. First of all, the charge of being a Muslim was 2008. You hear that lately? Yeah. The president we're talking about. Yeah. And then 2012. No. These weren't the present candidates, namely Ben Carson or Donald Trump. These were Newt Gingrich and Herman Cain. And so it seems like we recycle these stories. And so what I really want to do with my time here is not just talk about around, because it's in a broader context that we need to understand what's occurring. We can talk policy if we want. We can talk politics if we want. We can also talk culture and religion. And we'll go through the slides and look at them. But I'm just saying that it's into that context that we have to think. And Kathy, she's a psychiatrist, psychologist, anyway. She's a person who would understand what I'm about to say, which is that the most powerful resource we have is how we think. And they refer, these folks who know us better than we know ourselves, they refer to metacognition and meta-mood, right? And so as we understand ourselves better, we're better able to understand others. And I really think Americans, by way of introduction, they really need to better understand themselves. We need to understand how we think. What is our mood? Why do we react the way we do, seemingly over and over again? And so we have an issue. And I think that the Iran question puts it all really into the fire. Because we may not just be those who think of ourselves as simply those who help others, Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere else in the world, there's these questions of foreign policy. But frankly, maybe the question is, what is our need and how might some others meet it? And we might put ourselves into that position as the person who beside the ditch, or in the ditch beside the road, who is in need of help. Is there any prospect of that? Might we think about that this way? Okay, Paul says we can do this. I want to say briefly that I've taken the slides and put them into a bit of an introduction that comports with the report that I did a few years ago for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, in which, we'll get this up. How's this start? In which Scott Appleby, fundamentalism scholar at Notre Dame, and I collaborated over 2 years with policy professionals. These are government officials, CIA and otherwise, some members of Congress and others, and religious officials of all categories to put together Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, a new imperative of U.S. foreign policy. Thank you, sir. And so, by way of intro, let me simply say that I would like to talk a little bit about how my experience there fits into that question. Now, here's Scott. We did this at the Berkeley Center, and the Washington Post picked it up to say the report's primary language said that there's a huge God gap. A God gap not just by those of us who are Americans, but by policy professionals and others who do not understand the role of religion in public life. And so that by way of introduction, and if you want to read it, you can simply go Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The reason that it became so important was because not just that Barack Obama paid attention to it and distributed it to all of our embassies, but the fact that his wife and he, I think as well, are both members of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. In fact, he gave his first speech on foreign policy at the Chicago Council. And so there is a reason to believe that what we were saying in there is really important. And one of the first principles is that religion is influencing the world today more than ever before. And I'm going to have to ask your permission here for just a second to pull up, if you would like some of my comments, I'll be frank and say you can find them at rfpusa.org. I'll just Google it right now. This is religionsforpeace.org, where I wrote a piece. Your iPad is not connected to the internet. Maybe you can do that. Can you do that on your phone? I don't know. Anyway, the very first principle that we discussed was the fact that religions are playing a huge influence on public policy all around the world. Now, we know that there are those in the secular community who have always said, no, as a society becomes more modern, it becomes more irreligious. Wrong. In fact, as societies become more modern, we know that, in fact, they become more religious. In fact, the percentages of the population around the turn of the 20th century that were subscribers to one of the four major religions in the world were around 67%. By 1982, it had reached 73%. And by within the next decade or so, by 2050 at least, it may reach 80%, is what they say. And so religious groups, both in this country and around the world, are having more and more influence. Would you agree? Say, just give me a feedback. Do you think that's true? There are plenty of people who say, no, faith and religion are having less influence on public policy than ever before. I happen to think around the world, from all of my experiences, that they do more. Now, I will give you a little bit of background about how this happened, in the sense that When I worked for the National Association of Evangelicals, I was invited to go to Iran. The Friends Committee for National Legislation put it together, and my employers said no. I said, well, why not? This would really be helpful. They said, no, you will be tagged, Richard, as a liberal. I said, you're worried about that? Yes. So I couldn't go. So after I left the association, which was 2008, I was given a fellowship by the Open Society Foundation. Now this is the one was the conservative, these are the liberals, that's George Soros. So I again said, when invited, can I go to Iran? And they said, oh no, we already have one employee in arrest there, we don't want two. That's right. In Iran. So on both prior occasions, I had been invited, having met Ahmadinejad when he was in New York City to go, and I wasn't able to go. So what happened? Well, a number of things happened. One, Iran, looking for support, I think, okayed it. I just met some people in the last few days who've gone repeatedly through visa attempts and always been denied. And so I'll get to why I think ours succeeded. But we were invited in as the Global Peace Initiative of Women, GPIW, which has a subsidiary called the Contemplative Alliance. And we have traveled together as a group around the world. And so the founder of GPIW, if you've not heard of her before, is Dean of Marian Marstra, and this is Serene Jones. You know Serene? She's the president of Union Seminary. The first president of a major U.S. seminary, Serene Jones, in New York City. And Swami, here on my right, an American-born citizen, but also living as a Hindu Swami in India for the last 25 years. So, and then Greg Jones, who's a Buddhist, Zen Buddhist. So those are some of the components. But the point of this was to say that religious groups are being admitted, I think, very, very rarely, but nonetheless, into Iran when others are not. When we got to the entry point in Tehran, having gone through Dubai and a long trip, the first thing they said was, at the entry, they said, well, what do you do? I said, I'm a minister. Now, given the fact that I knew that Pastor Abedini was already arrested and in jail, I knew not to say pastor. And they said journalist. And I thought of Jason Resnick of the Washington Post. I said, no, not minister, clergy, religion. And the guy looked at me like he didn't know a word I was saying. I think he knew all along we were part of a group, and he was going to let us in. But nonetheless, it reminded me when I was going into Tel Aviv, and I said I was a lobbyist, and they got 5 people around to try and figure out what a lobbyist was. Lobbyist, what does that mean? You lobby government, you know? Anyway, that's what happened in Tel Aviv, but something quite different happened. So, interfaith. Yeah, I didn't used to do interfaith. When I was at the NA, first came in 1980, I always said, no, I don't do interfaith. That was the evangelical attitude. Ever heard that before? And I slowly began to change. And I have this aphorism which reflects my change on so many issues. It said, if you've never changed your mind about something, pinch yourself, you may be dead. And a lot of us are intellectually, if not otherwise, pretty close to death in America. Because we do not understand the world as it's changed. And so I would suggest that, one, religious groups are influencing the world more than ever before. And they are particularly so in Iran. Now, I just want to switch back to that first point again. Some of the religious groups that are influencing society get a lot of attention on the right, the conservatives. And I understand that Donald Trump just met with some televangelists, Prosperity Gospel or something in New York City, and I'm not surprised. I think the two are peas in a pod. But there is a counter-movement of evangelicals in this country, of which I am a part, and have some leadership role in helping build, called these new evangelicals. And what we are saying, if you don't remember from my last presentation here, which I'm sure you don't, we are saying, one, we believe in love, not hate or anger. We believe in unity, not division. We believe in a broad agenda, not a narrow agenda. And lastly, we believe that we should not be sublimating our faith to a political ideology. Those are the 4 components of what are new evangelicals. And just to give you some idea how we're influencing here, without belaboring the point, the Senate chairman of the Intelligence Committee, who's Richard Burr, whose colleague in North Carolina is Tom Tillich, said, I'll never change my position on the torture. I'm not going to release the torture report by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and moreover, I support torture. And this summer, as a group, we sent out a request into North Carolina. We got 35,000 people to sign a petition, and the next week at the vote in the Senate, both Burr and Tillich switched. They changed their minds. Why? Because in the state of North Carolina, 35,000 people signed petitions, and we put it on his desk. He changed his mind. Isn't that interesting? And this past week in support, since you'll know where I'm coming from when I tell you this, in support of an Iran deal, we put out a request and we got 146,000 people to sign our petition. It appeared in an op-ed in The Hill as well as Huffington Post. Why evangelical Christians support a deal. So in this country, there are these movements, such as this, well, you could call them the anti-religious right or whatever. We are these evangelicals who are for this kind of engagement. Follow me? And just as there are these kinds of groups here in this country, there are these kinds of groups there, both on the right and the left. And so one of those groups is the University of Religion and Denominations that meet in Qum. And they have a full faculty staff. They have a president who has raised funds. And somebody needs to help me get on the internet here. Paul, is that possible from here?
Probably not possible.
Oh, probably not possible. Okay. Well, then I'm really without my notes. But what I was going to say is that what happened at the religions and denominations meetings is that leaders came forward and met with us. We spent a better part of 2 days together, and you'll see some pictures here of what happened. Very interestingly enough, women play probably a role that you might not imagine in Iran. And the candidates, the woman immediately in the foreground, a PhD candidate in religion, second to her, Serene Jones and others are very influential in doing this. And so you can see a few shots here about what we were doing. And mostly what we were doing is answering basic questions about how do Americans think about Iran, how do Iranians think about America. And the one thing, the president of the denomination said, look, we do not have a problem with Americans. We have a problem with American foreign policy. A big distinction. And when we traveled around the country, I got caught sorry with their mouth. Probably good like that one. But as we traveled around the country, the one thing we really found is that Iranians would come up to us and say, American. And we would say, if we were comfortable with the moment, say yes. And then they would say, oh, fantastic, they'd say, we love Americans. Now, we were told by our host, look, depending on the circumstances, if it looks a little bit threatening, and there were a few cases when we were, this is in Qum, I'll get to this mullah right here. There are a few cases in which there were groups of people who looked like maybe we shouldn't be engaging with them, in which case we were told, if you are asked if you're American, just say you're Canadian. And so on one such occasion where it looked like, maybe we should say we're Canadian, I took the leadership and said, we're Canadian. And these young men, probably all tech businessmen wanting, to make business connections, said, oh, we're so sorry. And I don't know how many people here have been to Iran. It's really kind of hard to get into. Clyde has 4 years. 4 years. You served there. Well, anyway, you could just give this talk. Anyway, but I love this picture. I jumped out of the bus, which is what we were in here, and I caught it. And this is in Qum, the Shia capital of the world. And he is dressed to the nines, as we would say, and handsome as... but why did I take this picture?
The Apple Store.
Absolutely. You do not find McDonald's or the others, You can find one McDonald's store that serves great pizza in Tehran. We went there. But otherwise, you're not going to. But here you do have one little snippet picture of, the West. And of course, with the change that may occur as a result of the Iran deal, I assume it will, there's going to be a lot more business opportunities. If you could go to rfpusa.org. Yeah, and then just hit this one right there. Yeah, and that will remind me of my points. Yeah, I think so. And so, no, that doesn't quite get you. You'll somehow, well, you'll have to just find the RFP store. It's called Vignettes from Iran.
Okay.
You can find it.
Rich,
And I
that
could
looks
probably,
like, that looks like an Apple store.
that's what I mean. It's an Apple.
That's what you said McDonald's, I thought.
No, I said you can find a McDonald's.
Okay.
There is one in Tehran. They serve great pizza. But otherwise, you really don't want to go to McDonald's anyway, and you hope you don't find any there. But you do find an Apple store, which is some. There's something there. I mean, that's a little bit yet of what you find. Okay, back here. One of the real issues that Americans have, and at least my second point, is that religion is used both. Religion and religious influences both respond to globalization, but they're also a reaction to globalization. And the conservatives in Tehran, led by the Grand Ayatollahs, who we'll get to in a minute, they insist on this issue called the hijab. And for some, the burqa, and for others, chador. But anyway, our women don the hijab, as you can tell. The woman in the middle you may not recognize, but she is a powerhouse. She is a Dominican sister, Joan Chittister. That's her right here. And you may read her writing. She's just absolutely out of the box. And an irritant to the Catholic Church and to others all the time. But she's fantastic. And yet, Americans use this issue of culture against them. And yet, for most of them, I would say it's not an issue. Although you can tell because of their age how they feel about this. And you'll not exactly be able to tell because this is Qom. And in Qom, you're going to get a lot more conservative reaction, being the Shia capital, than you will in other places. In Tehran, which I'll get to a little later, they will put the hijab on the back of the head depending on their age. In other words, how much you cover the head says something about the cultural or religious police in the city or the countryside, wherever they're at. But our women, the Swamini here, and this is how they dressed going into the mosques. And in some mosques, they were not permitted. And you see here, because it is a conservative city, how this woman in the middle is dressed. This is the Grand Mosque in Qom. And I caught this ceremony. There was a funeral procession, which you can tell what it is, right? But I captured the picture, and this man may not have approved it, and yet I just found it so interesting. And it was in, if I have my history correct, it was in these grand mosques of Qom and elsewhere that the Ayatollah Khomeini began preaching, and then was arrested by the Shah. And then, of course, he fled the country and then came back. But it was in these huge mosques that you have, there's a better picture of it, of some of the traditions. Now, one of those is that you don't ask, excuse me, you do ask a woman for a picture before you take it. And I can't tell how much, this is one of my favorite pics, how much this was a result of her being annoyed at my doing this, or how much it was just surprise. But you're supposed to ask. And I was panning with my iPad, and thus I couldn't really ask her. But I think that bespeaks so much about the current relationship with Iran. And so religion both serves the conservatives in the sense that they are reacting against globalization and forcing, in some cases, not just the dress, but the behavior and everything else. But the degree to which it occurs is dependent on the place. This is the Grand Mosque in Isfahan. And then we go back to Tehran. This is the second largest square in the world, next to, I'm told, the square in Beijing, Tiananmen Square. So very interestingly enough, when the Shah built it, unlike in Beijing, where you have nothing but government buildings that adjoin Tiananmen Square, you have nothing but business shops all the way around. The second largest square in the world, which says something about the Shah. In other words, businessmen selling carpets and everything else. But that was taken. Then, this is just outside Tehran, where men and women who fled the Shah's spies would go. And the Revolutionary Guard met often in the hills outside Tehran, we're told. And even today, if you follow, you can see that the further up in the hills you get, the further back on the head the hijab goes. Follow what I'm saying? So if you can get away from the religious police, which leads me to say something about this role of religion, which is to say that there is a movement in America called the nuns. You're acquainted with this? They represent 16 to 20% of the public. They're growing. These are not N-U-N-S. These are N-O-N-Es. And the same thing is occurring in Iran. And in fact, in Tehran itself, 1.5% do Friday prayers, go to Friday prayers. 1.5%. Serene Jones wrote about this. You can Google her. But she maintains that the same trends that are occurring here vis-a-vis religion are occurring there. And the real question is, what will the kids do? This is one of my favorite picks. And 50% of the population is under 25. Get a load of that. 50% is under 20. Most of them don't even remember the revolution. And they love Americans, and they'll reach out in any way possible to make contact. But that's not the stereotype. I'm standing next to a man when I arrived in Isfahan, and he comes up. He was in work clothes, somewhat shabbily dressed, unshaven, and he stood next to me and he said, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yes, and we love Iranians." He said, "Well, that's not the perception." I said, "Well, thank you, sir." And then he marched away. But, the perception is, Americans do not, like Iranians, when, in fact, I'm not sure that's true at all, but that's the perception there. Now, Grand Ayatollah, Bergeroud is how you spell his name, as I recall, is one of the 6 most influential Grand Ayatollahs. And he met with us. We spent about an hour. This was my photo, which goes to show how close I was sitting next to him. And what he was saying was, it's the great powers of the world that are precipitating this crisis. And the great powers, as he refers to them, are in Saudi Arabia, in the United States, and in Israel, America's proxy in the region. But mostly he engaged in this conversation. Yes, there was. He asked for responses to his assertion, his thesis, that these 2 major powers are what are making life difficult, so to speak. And in fact, he and others there were suggesting, you see, that America's role is in fostering a fight, in fact, between Shia and Sunnis. I think he thinks that possibly he wasn't entirely clear about that, but others very clearly said that. America is interested in forcing off a fight between the 2. And of course, as a Shia leader, you can understand why the Grand Ayatollah has this ongoing enmity with the Saudis who are Sunnis. You follow me? But the idea that they think we are playing off the one against the other for our advantage, I think is false. I don't believe that's true. But that's what he was asserting. I told him, in fact, I said, I should say, he asked, how much influence do you have? And the Swami responded, he said, well, we try to educate our communities and live a lifestyle that's different, that's oriented around peacemaking and not war making. And he looked at me, because I had been and was introduced as an evangelical. He looked at me like, well, sir, what about you? And I said, look, I opposed the Second Iraq War. I said that because that's not only true, but because I wanted to hopefully build a bridge and to say, look, I don't just buy American foreign policy just because I'm an American. And it's pretty obvious that a lot of Iranians don't buy Iranian policy either, just because of the mullahs. In fact, the younger generation of women, I should say, including our guide here, the Heshti, famous Iranian family, said, I hate the mullahs. And I said, well, why do you hate them? She says, what they do to us. And she regards it as male hierarchy that could care less about women. She's standing next to Greg, as you see, the Zen Buddhist, and here's Dina conversing with arguably one of the most influential women in all of Iran. Her name is Marianne Zarif. She is married to Zarif, the foreign minister who was negotiating the deal. And she had spent 10 years in the United States when he was foreign minister, representative of the UN. And if you don't repeat the story, I'll tell you. She said, for 10 years, I met with a Sufi master. And I'm sort of adding this up and I'm saying, so Iran today imprisons and leaders of the Sufi religion disappear. And she's in New York and San Francisco with her husband over 10 years meeting with a Sufi master, and she's telling us in a government building, in effect, without speaking too loudly, that in effect, she's saying, I myself, one of those whom my own government persecutes. Now, isn't that interesting? I consider it so. And she took a real interest in me, asked me to sit across from her at the lunch we had, because she understood, unlike the Swami, who said, look, we just are interested in influencing our own communities and being an alternative lifestyle, an alternative witness, the evangelicals and others in this country aren't content with that. We know from all the comments that have been made about Iran and opposing the Iran deal, it's been a big, huge part of the Republican campaign for the White House now, that they are interested in changing American policy. In fact, some have said they'd scrap the deal, tear it up. You've heard this, right? And so this is a very smart woman who is attempting, I think, in her own way as a leader to build bridges. I'm really proud of her. This is the future young kids. Like I said, 50% under 25. And this is whom some people in this country, I would dare say, think are our enemy. They are not our enemies. They are our neighbors. And will we love them as we should? And it's about 10:17. This is outside one of the major mosques. You can tell sort of where they're at. Check this out. Back of the head, front of the head. And believe me, if you take that hijab off, the religious police will arrest you. I'm sorry, I'm getting towards the end of these, and we can talk about some of these issues. But I happen to think, for example, that religious freedom is one of those central issues which has come as a result of all these changes. The empowerment of religious faith around the world, the backlash against it, and the way in which religion is used by terrorists and others. But religious liberty, as a result, has become a big issue. And if you don't know some of these faces, I'll tell you because they're really important in our American experience. Sean Casey, appointed by John Kerry, who we knew back when he was in the United States Senate, to head up this new public engagement office in the State Department. In other words, there's a faith-based office in a lot of the agencies. The office here is a public engagement office, and it's not quite in the same ilk as the others. And I happen to think it's for these very same purposes. But let me say, the Chicago Council interviewed all these public officials, current and former. That was over a 2-year period from 2008 to 2010. And they could only point to one program to meet with Muslim leaders overseas. And after a couple of years, it was disbanded because it was said to be unconstitutional. I don't know if that comports with what the rest of you think, but I can tell you that that is what was testified. One program by the United States government to meet with mullahs and ayatollahs and others overseas, funded by the United States government, not funded by outsiders. I've participated in programs with Marshall Brieger and Bob Destro at Catholic University meeting with Ayatollahs outside Rome over the past few years on occasions. But see, those are privately funded. And I'm just saying, what does it matter with our own government? And that's one of the recommendations of the report, that every embassy ought to have a staff person that understands the religious community in the country, that you ought to have a presence in the United States Department of State who carries these issues, which is Sean does. And the man in the middle, does anybody know that guy? Religion, the Missing Dimension of American Foreign Policy. Doug Johnston. Famous book that helped change a lot of thinking. We happen to think that our report as well has been influential in moving Kerry, who said at a recent meeting at Georgetown University I was part of, he said, if I could go back and do it all over, Kerry actually said I'd get a degree in international relations with an emphasis upon interfaith relations, dialogue, and the rest. Isn't that interesting? He's come to realize just how important it plays a role. I only put this in because as an interfaith group, the Contemplative Alliance, we have traveled. This is at Tiger's Nest in Bhutan from about a year and a half ago. And you catch some of the same personalities, but there's Dina and there's myself and there's Swami and Stradalu, who's from India, Indian Hindu master, and one of the most famous Iranian musicians in the world, you can Google his name, is Dawood, D-A-V-O-O-D, who happens to be Sufi, and when we were meeting in his home as a group, Nilafar Beheshti, our guide, at one point left the room. And I asked one of my colleagues, why did she leave the room? And I was told by one of my colleagues, well, I think it had to do with something with the fact that we were discussing the oppression of Sufis in Iran, and Dawood himself is Sufi, and she didn't want, for reasons, to have to report to her superiors what was saying, and if she had a bug on her, she didn't want them to hear. So whichever it was, she did not want to be party to that conversation. So major Sufi leaders, as there are others in Iran who are under arrest, and we hope all that will change. This is just my point, not to show you Tiger's Nest, or to turn this into a travelogue, except to say that these things are really important, and Americans need to be a part of this. And we need to do more of it. I know all of you travel or have traveled, and I really think that if more of our members of Congress had passports, we wouldn't have the policies we have. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just from a divinity school, and if you don't know Doug Stone, over here, Lieutenant General Doug Stone, just an amazing guy who has pioneered a program of meeting with Muslim leaders around the world and approaching all of these issues, I think torture, detainees, Gitmo, and training local law enforcement in the United States. So let me make a last point. By the way, Ingrid Mattson, the former president of ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, were the keynote speakers there in Nashville last weekend. But look, if you ever wonder where the word bigot came from? Well, I'll tell you. I looked it up. I had used the word so often, I decided I needed to. And essentially, what the word, according to Wikipedia, comes from. The Normans. Well, Rollo was his name. He was a duke of the Normans, and he had a son who wanted to marry the daughter of King Charles. And there was this habit that you had to kiss the king's butt. And Rollo said, no, you put your foot up. And the king said, no, you kiss my foot. And Rollo said, by God, no. And the king said, bigot. That's according to Wikipedia. But it implies, you see, that you don't show respect for someone else's religion, culture, ethnicity, or whatever. And I happen to think that we have a problem. Now, let me simply, without belaboring the point, which is this. 12% of Americans ever have contact with somebody of another religion, particularly Islam, on any frequent or infrequent basis. Only 12%. And a much smaller percent on a regular basis. Something like 5 or less. A regular contact with someone of Muslim faith is that small. And then to make matters worse, according to the Pew Forum, around 65% of Christians think that if a Muslim commits violence, he's a Muslim. But if a Christian commits violence, well, only 30% think he's really a Christian. He's just a terrorist or a criminal. You follow? That is called a disconnect, according to Pew Forum and others. A disconnect, a total blind spot in how you view someone else. A 40% disparity between the one and the other. And then when you put together the fact that the Tea Party and evangelicals, 60% of evangelicals, a higher percent of Tea Party, do not believe that Islam is part of our shared American values. Not a part. Not a part of our shared American values. No, that's not a question unless it's in the person's mind who answers. That's not a question about our heritage, which definitely was not Muslim. No, that's a question today. Is it part of our shared American values? A society in which Muslims by 2050 will number 34 million. Think if I have the numbers correct. You follow what I'm saying? And so there is a real disconnect. There's a blind spot. There's a guide gap at the foreign policy level, but there's also a guide gap here in our own community. And one last picture. This was done in Knoxville, where you have real serious Islamophobia. And in fact, in the next few days, they are planning, conservative groups are planning events all around, 4 or 5 different cities, urging that, as one of our presidential candidates has suggested, that they be expelled. Muslims just be expelled. And so what we are doing in Knoxville is, first we start with a focus group. If you'd like the focus group questions, I'll send them to you, but we spend about 3 hours, and have done so on 2 different occasions, with pastors, in this case in Knoxville. And you see my friend Tony Ritchie and others. Here is a Muslim woman who's a scholar in residence there in Knoxville, as well as the local imam. My friend Aaron, who is with the Religions for Peace, and here I am. Just to give you some idea, I handed them a movie which I am part of. It's just been released for review, and AOL just raved about it, and it's being considered at Sundance, called "They Know Not What They Do About Climate Change." And I said to the pastors, these guys, I said, now this isn't what we're about here. I just want you to know I care about this, and in the interest of honesty, take it home and watch it. And my friend Tony in the middle, standing next to the imam, said they all called him and said, crazy. We're not going to talk about that, are we? This isn't about that, is it? And he assured them, no, this is about this issue. But you see, where they're coming from is just real deep suspicion of folks. So I have my own building of bridges. So that's about all I have to say. Let's see, was that the last one? Oh, I took this. I closed this one. I took it very early in the morning, about 6:45, on the mall, just before the papal arrival. Isn't that beautiful? I haven't seen such clouds above the Capitol in recent days. Maybe it occurs all the time.
You got to submit it.
What?
You have to submit it.
I'll have to submit it to
photography.
Yeah.
Washington Post.
Yeah, Washington Post, somebody. I think God or somebody was sending us these beautiful pictures that day. And I happen to think the trend lines are for the better. They're good. There are these real liabilities. We can turn on the lights, and I can just leave that on if you want. But anyway, I'm willing to take any questions. I apologize if it was more of a travel log than something else, but it's just where I'm at. Thank you.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Were you able to meet with any Jewish, Armenian, or Presbyterian representatives when you were in Iran?
One Armenian, no Presbyterian, and Jewish. I think on one occasion, yes, we had in Qum at the Denominations and Religions University. There was not a rabbi, but at least one person. They would allow that at the university, but I'm sure elsewhere probably not. They're really careful. They try not to appear like they're handling us, so as to say, we're watching you, but they sort of are. It's a soft touch that they have, and yet there's a real hard touch too. I have talked with the Washington Post editors and others about Jason Rezniak. We need to pray about him. He's been in prison over a year. And the same for Pastor Abedini and the others. And it's not yet clear what will happen, but I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful because he doesn't deserve to be there. But it's just part of that building of bridges, I think, that has been so badly battered way back to 1953. And if you talk to Iranians, they know the whole story. You talk to a school kid, I did. He knows the story of the CIA intervention to bring down, Iran's, by the CIA in 1953. And they just regard this as intervention. And I remember one anecdote from a previous conversation in which an American military type said, "What are you worried about?" And this Iranian leader said, "Excuse me, but you have all these troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. How would you feel if you had Iranian troops on either shore? Just off your shores, Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. How would you feel about that? Would you feel a little bit threatened?" I rest my case. Of course they do. They look at this and they see Americans as, as playing big power politics, and yet at the individual level, they're the very warmest as Persians. They're just so warm, and I happen to think their complexion and everything is sort of Indo-European from what I've read, very different from others, and they are just an incredibly beautiful people. So bright, with such a 500-year plus history or 5,000-year history that just goes back forever, and much to be proud of. I think this venue.
Thanks for your presentation. Should we take seriously when the leaders of Iran say that the demise of Israel is one of their goals? Should we? How should we do that?
I'm not enough of a foreign policy scholar to say, except I would say this. Do not take the Death to America rallies in the streets as anything but government-allowed protests to allow the right wing to voice its discontent. Do not interpret the Death to America or whatever that occurs in the rallies in the major cities that still presumably do occur to be anything more than a venting for the right wing, which does oppose this deal. You follow what I'm saying? I mean, I really believe that this is gamesmanship. It's politics, just like we have politics here. And if anybody thinks that, the Republican Senate can reject the deal, as the new senator from Oklahoma wrote to the Ayatollahs. Remember that story? Mm-hmm. The senator from Oklahoma, a young guy, newly elected, sponsored and got 46 Republican senators to send a letter to the Ayatollahs of Iran saying, we control foreign policy. Just you remember that. And the Ayatollahs wrote back with a lesson on the American Constitution. But the point is that both countries have these. And I just happen to think this deal is the best that can be negotiated, and it's a wise step forward, and it will change things because I can't fully answer that question.
Well, it's more about Israel than the
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I really... one of the things you don't want to do is put nuclear weapons in the hands of people who say things like that, whether or not they mean it or not. Wouldn't you agree? And so that's why the deal. Let's keep nukes out of the hands of people. One of our leaders, I forget which, Obama or Kerry, has referred to the crazies. Well, whether they are or not, maybe their fears are justified, but I don't interpret everything that occurs in a rally in the streets in Tehran or any other city there as interpretive of what the leadership thinks any more than somebody else would or should think about that in America. I mean, you don't take protests in Lafayette Square as a representative of U.S. policy. I mean, we really need to be circumspect and, take some metacognition and meta-attitude lessons and understand why we think and react the way we do. And learn how to be a neighbor, and most of all as Christian people. What does that mean when Jesus said this? And I'll tell you one anecdote. In 2003, I put together a forum for the association in response to the claims by Franklin Graham and others that Islam is an evil and wicked religion. And we sent a message around the world. This was 2003, I believe, about the time of the war, that was picked up by evangelical missionaries meeting in Seoul, Korea, and they all, 100 of them, said, "Amen, thank you very much." Really, finally, missionary leaders and others meeting in Seoul said, "Thank you very much for responding to that kind of bigotry." It didn't win me any friends through the Billy Graham Association. But I happen to think that Billy, as opposed to his son, would probably agree with me. And moreover, I went forward and said, not only that calling Islam an evil and wicked religion makes no sense and is simply bigotry, but I don't think we should be holding a prayer rally at the Pentagon at the start of a war, which is what Franklin Graham was doing. I still repeat that. That's my position. It doesn't make any sense. Why would we do that? What, to bless our war? I don't think it makes any sense. And so a lot of this is, I think, a lot of what occurs in American society is misunderstanding. It's ignorant. Some of it is bigotry. It's a combination of all these things, but we need to get beyond that. And most of all, we ought to be electing leaders who know how to get beyond that. And instead of just sanctioning comments, it's really amazing to me that a candidate for president can say something so outrageous, and nobody in the party, his own party, or her own party, will ever say, "Hey, that's wrong." And that goes back all the way to 2008. And so there's something very deep when 46% of one party happens to believe the President of the United States is a Muslim or wasn't even born in America. So we have a deep polarization, and some of it is born of ignorance and bigotry and all the rest of it. I would hope that Christian people would be really, really careful not to succumb to that. Anything else? Yes?
You said, on the one hand, that the nuns, that attitude, not participating in religion, but that's spreading around the world. On the other hand, religion is influencing policy and events in the world more than ever. Superficially, that looks like a conflict.
Yeah, it does.
Can you explain a relationship between those two things?
Well, it's just like in America. You have, I happen to think, increasing influence by faith groups on policy levels. That's really important. But on the other hand, you still have a rise of the nuns that come from disaffected religious communities. So where are the nuns coming from? It's interesting. I had a friend at Pew tell me that most of the exiles from the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church, exiles from the Catholic and the Southern Baptist Convention are going to the Episcopal Church. But anyway, among the younger evangelicals and the millennials, there's a trend toward away from partisanship. So the latest survey data shows, this is one of the first ever, that the younger evangelicals are moving not from Republican to Democrat, but from Republican to Independent, and it's statistically significant. And some of that is just a pushback against the heavy partisanship that you see coming from pastors and others. You follow what I'm saying? And so they're disgusted with some of that language, the way churches have been turned into partisan footballs, and they're looking for a real relationship with Christ that brings these kinds of values, I think, that we're talking about here today, which is really what the gospel is about, in my opinion. Yes, Paul?
Richard, maybe you could close on that note.
Yeah, we got to close.
Thank you.
Okay, quick prayer. Before I pray, one quick. Crystal Stendhal was a humanist pastor, a scriptural scholar, and he called for the next stage in this emerging relationships of interfaith, and particularly in Jewish-Christian relations. But he has often told the story, this comes from my friend Pedro O'Hare's book called Spiritual Companions. He tells this story of the rabbi who asked his students, "Do you love me?" To which the student replies, "You know I love you, Rabbi." "Do you know," the rabbi asks, "what makes me happy? What makes me sad?" "No, Rabbi," replies the student. "Then how then," says the rabbi, "can you say you love me if you do not know me? If you do not know what makes me happy, what makes me sad? How can you do that?" And so we're looking toward a kind of relationship, a spiritual companionship of love. I think that's this next stage that we all need to be pursuing. Let's pray. Thank you, God our Father, for loving us so much, for giving us the duty, the responsibility to care and love. May we live today, leave today, and live today as a result of your words that say, be a neighbor. Don't just be a neighbor, act like a neighbor. And may that come to pass in our lives. In Jesus' name.
Thank you all for coming. See you next week.